So in this video, we're going to talk about one of the most important things about Express, and that is it supports the concept of what's called middleware. Now, if you're familiar with ASP.NET Core or Owen or anything like that from the .NET side, you will be familiar with the concept. If not, basically what middleware is it's a pipeline of different pieces of code that can manipulate your request and your response in a serial sort of way, and middleware can be nested and all that fun stuff. So basically, to put it simply, middleware is a function that does something and then may or may not decide to move on to the pipeline. So let's say we wanted to do authentication, where the user sends in a cookie on every request, and we want to look that up and convert it into a session token, do some cryptographic madness, and validate it, JWT maybe, I don't know. However you might want to do it, or a bearer authentication token, something like that. And we want that to happen on every single request. We want this little authentication code to happen, and it might say, okay, you're logged in, or okay, you're not logged in, and then it'll inform everything below it whether or not you've authenticated. So how would we do something like that? Well, we would create a middleware. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say app.use. So the use function on the Express app is the way that you add middleware. And like I said, middleware is just a function. And it's a function that's going to take in three parameters: request, response, and next. So request and response should be pretty straightforward. I name them the exact same as our app.get example because they're the exact same objects. We have access to both querying from the request, figuring out what the user wanted to do, or manipulating the response in some sort of way. But what's next? Well, next is simply invoke this function to go to the next middleware, or finally to the request handler. So what we can do here is I can do something like, I'll just console log out stuff. In middleware 1, and then I'll invoke next, and console log in middleware 1. Or how about out of middleware 1? And so let's see what effect this has on our application. So I'm going to come back over here to the left-hand side on my console, and I'm simply going to type in nodemon server and hit enter. And so it says server started on port 3000, like what we would expect it to do. So now let's come over here to our browser window and hit refresh and see what happened. We still get our hello world, but on the console log we got in middleware 1, out of middleware 1. So we can make this example maybe a little bit more interesting. I could say response.write, and I can say header, and I won't be able to response right at the bottom because our get ends the response from there. But now I can come over here and refresh and see header right there. So our middleware actually went on and was executed before our code here, before our response.end. And then when next was invoked, the pipeline continued, and then once this line of code executed on line 12, the pipeline finished. And I can prove that by saying down here, console log in handler, and then save that. And then off screen, I'm going to go ahead and hit F5. And now what we see is in middleware 1, in handler, and then out of middleware 1. And we can stack middleware if we want. I can say app.use, request, response, next. And I can say response, write, other, and then next. And now if I come over here, well, actually I can go ahead and also say in middleware 2, and then out of middleware 2. Maybe indent it a little bit to make the output a little clearer. So save that out. Come back over here to our browser, hit F5, we see header, and then we see other, and then we see a response. And we can see a similar thing over here, where we say in middleware 1, and then in middleware 2, and then in handler, then out of middleware 2, and out of middleware 1. Okay, so these response writes might mess things up a little bit, but so let's go ahead and take them out. What's interesting, though, let's say I commented out this next here, and then came back over here and refreshed. Notice how nothing happens. And nothing happens because we are not going past the pipeline. So actually, something did happen, but this code never got executed, and as a result, the response never ended. And since we never signaled to that stream, the response stream that we want to finish, it's just kind of sitting there and doing nothing. But the important thing to understand here is by commenting out this next, when we don't invoke the next piece in the pipeline, we don't get this code to execute. So that's obviously not the behavior that we're looking for in this case. So I'll put that in. So that's it. It's a pretty straightforward concept. So you can just you can think of it as a request start. So we have the browser, node, and then Express, and then middleware 1, middleware 2, middleware 3, or however many middlewares you have, followed by the handler. And then it goes the other way back. So then it goes, this is going to be hard to write. Then it goes back to M3, and then M2. I can just represent that with like that. And then so on and so on until it finally goes back to the browser. So this is sort of a diagram of how to think about middleware. So it's a very straightforward concept. It can be a little bit confusing sometimes when you can't visualize your pipeline, but overall just think of middleware as wrapping something in a pipeline. So what's an example of a very, very useful middleware that you might want? Well, what's interesting about the way this HTTP server is configured is it's not actually going to serve out any static files, which is commonly something that you would want to do in a web server. You would want to serve out static files because, well, you want to serve out your JavaScript files and your style sheets and all that fun stuff. So Express comes with it, built in, a middleware that can serve out static files. So hopefully the way that this is going to look should start to really make sense here. What we do is we say simply app.use, and then I'm going to simply type in express.static public. So I'm going to say app.use and then express.static, and then I'm passing in a parameter to the middleware, and that's a public folder that I'm about to create. So what this does is express.static is a middleware, but what it'll do is it'll go out, it'll try to find a file that matches your path within the specified directory that we specified as this parameter or this argument here. And if it exists, it will simply serve out that file instead of continuing on the stream. So I can actually kind of make this a little bit more interesting. Instead of putting the app.use express static right there, let's do it in between our two middlewares. And right now, it's not going to have any effect because we don't even have a public folder. And obviously, since we don't have it, it's empty. There's no static files to serve. So let's come over here to our Explorer, or our Solution Explorer, and create a new folder and call it public. So now Express is configured to serve out any file from public before it even hits any of our middleware 2 or our other handlers. So I'm going to right-click, create a new file, and I'm going to call this styles.css. And then I'll say, I don't know, body background is gray. All right, so I have a very basic styles.css in my public directory. Again, my public directory is what's being served out by Express. So if I come over here to my browser window, and I refresh, I still get my route because the Express static middleware couldn't find a file that matched the path of /. But if I do /styles.css, check that out. Two interesting things happened here. First of all, we got a static file served to us by Express, and that's really what we were going for. But something a little bit more subtle happened here, and you can see that on the left-hand side. See, when we hit the home page, we got in middleware 1, out of middleware 1, in middleware 2, in handler, out of middleware 2, but when we asked for a static file, we got in middleware 1, out of middleware 1. So if I just refresh that, it never completed to go all the way through the pipeline and hit middleware 2 or our request handler. So the static middleware sort of short-circuited the entire thing. It's very important to understand the order of middleware because sometimes middleware has a performance cost to it. For example, the express.static actually has to look at the file structure and figure out, does a file exist? So it might be more useful if you were to put your express.static middleware underneath your handlers, for example, so that your handlers will override any potential static file that is in that directory. It's also might be interesting if you're working with authentication. You might want to put your authentication middleware underneath your static middleware. Why would you want to do that? Well, you'd want to do that because you don't want your authentication logic to hit unless you are not serving a static file. Generally speaking, when you have a public directory, you can access all of those files in a typical scenario without any sort of authentication. Now, that's up to you, but that's just generally how it works out. So you would want to put your authentication middleware underneath your static middleware so that you're not wasting time calculating authentication tokens if all they wanted was a public file. Now, you can use as many static middlewares as you want. You might want to serve out your public stuff, and then you might want to have a different directory for private stuff that does have authentication logic. It's up to you. And this is why the pipeline is so flexible, and it's really why Microsoft in ASP.NET Core really moved over to this sort of paradigm as opposed to the old HTTP handlers from IIS. One more super subtle thing about this I just want to point out for fun. You'll notice that it says in middleware 1 and then it immediately says out of middleware 1. But if I were to comment out this use express static and refresh, it says in middleware 1, then in middleware 2, then out of middleware 2, then out of middleware 1. Think for a sec why adding this app use express static, why adding that would make in middleware 1 and then out of middleware 1, or, whoops, right there. So think of why using express static would do in middleware 1 and then out of middleware 1 when I request this path. Think for a sec why I would do that. Well, the answer comes into the internals of express.static. Most likely what's going on is it's starting in a synchronous request, so that what happens is the next invokes this middleware, but then this middleware starts in a synchronous operation, which results in next completing, and then this being invoked before the asynchronous operation finishes, and that would mean before middleware 2 gets invoked. So that's why we're seeing that little oddity right there, but it has to do with the asynchronous nature of express.static. It's not a huge deal in this example, just a fun bit of trivia if you were confused why it was behaving like that. Anyway, so now let's go ahead and talk about views. So very often we want what's called a templating engine. We don't want to write our HTML in JavaScript. That would be pretty awful. So what we want to do is we want to serve out a file, an HTML file, but we want it to have logic in it to where we can conditionally show and hide different things, maybe set a message, do something like that. It's a very common thing that you're going to do. So what you need is templating engine. And the templating engine that's most commonly used with Express is called Jade. Now, this series isn't really about Jade. You can definitely check out the documentation, but for our purposes, it's very straightforward to use and to understand. It has a very clean syntax. It is white space sensitive, which is a little weird. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can use Jade. First of all, Jade is an additional package that we need to install. So I'm going to right-click and open up another command prompt. I'm simply going to type in npm, whoops, not caps, npm install jade -- save. So go ahead and install Jade. And again, it's a whole new language. It's its own templating language that allows us to construct HTML page, similar to like Razor, if you're familiar with ASP.NET, or Ruby on Rails' default templating engine. So let's go ahead and move this off to the side. And what I'm going to do here is, now that we've installed Jade, we need to inform Express of Jade's existence. And that's very easy to do. Up here on this, right after we create the app, we're going to configure it a little bit. I'm going to simply say app.set view space engine, followed by, in quotes, Jade. So the Jade isn't so much as a magic string as it is a name, the name of the package of the view engine that we want to use. So by doing this, Jade knows how to talk to Express. We just told, hey, Express, go ahead and spool up this package, and it knows how to talk to you, and everything will magically work. And also, if you're wondering, yes, the space in this configuration option does bug me. I don't know why it's view space engine. I guess on a technical level, it doesn't matter because it's in quotes, but I don't know, it kind of bugs me. Anyway, that's how we set up Jade. So how do we use Jade? Well, it's very straightforward. Over here on my Solution Explorer, I'm going to right-click, New Folder, and create a folder called Views. inside of views is where we're going to put our Jade files. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click, new file, and I'm going to create a file called index.jade. Now, Visual Studio Code does have support for Jade syntax highlighting. So let's look at the syntax of Jade. Pretty straightforward. It's whitespace sensitive, so we type in HTML to put in our doc type and our HTML tag, and then we tab over. So we don't have closing brackets or opening brackets. We don't have tags. We don't have anything like that. Everything is whitespace sensitive. So then I'm going to open up my head element. So notice how I'm creating these elements just by typing in the name of the element. And then in head, I'm going to say title equals title. So this is interesting. I'm creating a title element, but I'm telling it I want the content of the title element to come from a variable called title. We will see how we can set variables here in a moment. Then I'm going to say link rel equals style sheet, so this should look familiar, comma href equals / styles.css, which points to our styles CSS file right there, and then rel equals style sheet. And so that's the syntax that we use in Jade to specify attributes on an element. So the element's name is link, and then these are the attributes we're specifying. Now we're done with the head. Let's go ahead and make our body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to untab out and simply type in body. And then I'm going to forward tab in, and I'm going to say, how about site wrap followed by h1 hello world. So basically, we are opening up a body tag, then we're opening up a div with a class of site wrap. That's what this dot syntax does. If I just did that without the dot, it would create an element called site wrap, but obviously in HTML, there is no such element. So by using the shorthand, this dot, it creates a div with site wrap. I could have done the same thing by doing div class equals site wrap. That would have done the exact same thing, but it's a little bit more verbose. Jade is very succinct. And if you're wondering, you can also make divs with IDs by simply saying blah, if you wanted to. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and see how we can have this template be rendered. It's very, very, very straightforward. So here's our template on the right-hand side. And to have it be rendered, I'm going to scroll down after our app-get root. I'm going to add another app-get. I'm going to say app-get, and I don't know, I'll do app-get / home request response goes into, and then to render out this template, I simply do response.render index, and then I can pass in an object with the variable. So in this case, title equals title. So what am I doing here? Response.render is a method from Express. And what it does is it renders out this view. So it passes in this name of this view into the view engine that we told it about. Now with the Jade, the default location for views is a folder called views. So that's why the name here is important. Jade will look into this views folder. Obviously you can override that folder if you want to. And then I'm saying response.render, passing in the name, and then I'm passing in an object. And all of these variables on this object, all these properties on this object are going to be passed into the view engine. So that, for example, right here, the title will be rendered out. It'll associate with that property. Notice the difference between this h1 and this title. There's this equals. Equals means go ahead and open up a JavaScript expression, whereas a space means stuff the content of this into the content of that element. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and move over. If you guys want to take a look at this code for a sec, go ahead and pause because I'm going to rearrange my windows a little bit. I'm going to close this out. I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to access /home, and we get an exception because duplicate. Oh, why did I do rel style sheet twice? I meant to do. You guys probably noticed that. I meant for one to be type text equals CSS. I didn't mean to do 2 rel style sheets. I'm glad Jade picked that up for me. Now we refresh, and not only do we see the style sheet was applied, but we see our title was grabbed from nodejs, and our hello world was rendered. So let's look at the source code of this. Basically, this Jade translates into this HTML. So we have our HTML, our head, our title, our style sheet, our closing head, which we didn't put in a closing head here. It's all white space sensitive. Followed by our body, followed by our div of site wrap, followed by our h1, and followed by our closing tags. All right, so that is really the basics of Express. Obviously, the way that you would extend Express is by using different middleware, and there's a lot of different things you can do with that. But I guess we'll see you guys in the next video.